So when we talk about cyclone tracks of these nor'easters, what are we actually talking about? Well, there's really three main tracks, but only two of them get to be designated nor'easters. So we have track A that basically tracks pretty much just right along the Canadian-United States border. It tracks just north of the Great Lakes and then goes up into the Canadian Maritimes. And track A has a name. It's called an Alberta Clipper, and oftentimes Alberta Clippers, they move a little bit to further north and west of New England to really just be impacted by any kind of additional atmospheric processes that happen. So Alberta Clippers, they're their own entity, and that's a lesson for another day. But track A very, very rarely gets created into a nor'easter. But track B and track C do get created into nor'easters. And so track B and track C both have names, and so that's what we're going to be discussing in the next section. So we're first going to start off talking about track C because track C is the easiest track to really understand. Track C has a low pressure system that originates out of the Gulf of Mexico. It crosses over the state of Florida and Georgia and actually redevelops and actually intensifies, becomes a little bit stronger off the coast of South Carolina, Georgia area. It then follows the jet stream up the east coast and impacts southern New England before continuing into northern New England or into the Canadian Maritimes. So you can see based off these arrows the storm track, and so you can kind of get an idea what the jet stream would look like. Here you would see a large trough. Here would be the trough axis where my mouse is indicating, and you can see how the storm just follows the path of the jet stream and moves into southern New England. So remember that nor'easters, they don't necessarily have to be all rain. Oftentimes they're either a mix of snow and rain. They're more popular during the fall and winter months and even the early spring. But nor'easters don't necessarily have to be all snow. But when we talk about them in the wintertime, we're usually talking about a nor'easter that brings snow. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the pressure patterns that are associated with that track C. And that track C actually has a name. It's called the Gulf of Mexico Atlantic Coastal Path because it does originate in the Gulf of Mexico and then rides along the east coast into southern New England. So here is one storm system from January of 1966. Here's the surface map for 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time or 12 UTC. And what we noticed here is our area of low pressure that will be our nor'easter. It's just starting off as a weak wave and actually is starting to gather some sort of circulation based on the isobars. You can see how this low is now closed. So this is a closed isobar. And here we have a low weak wave behind the low. And now this low is starting to generate a definitive warm front and a definitive cold front. So here it's really just starting to develop this little weak area of low pressure. But the other pressure patterns that I want you to take note of is the massive area of high pressure out in the Dakotas or just north of the Dakotas. But this high pressure system really just extends all the way down into Texas. It's a 1044 millibar high. You really don't see high pressure systems any higher than that. I believe the record was 1072 millibars, and that's the overall record. So you can imagine how big 1044 millibars are. And here you're really talking about because this is January, you're talking about a very cold air mass being brought all the way down into Canada or from Canada all the way down into the central part of the United States. You also have another area of low pressure that is now being very active out in the Canadian Maritimes. So here you notice all these isobars where the pressure actually decreases as we get towards the center. Now here, this is really off the screen, but based off these isobars, you can tell that it's pretty windy in New England. And remember that the winds are flowing pretty much parallel to these isobars, so the wind's coming out of the northwest. So we're having a lot of cold air being brought down into New England, and we're going to watch for this storm system to track just along the east coast and impact southern New England. So 12 hours later, here's 12 hours later, what do we have? And so here you can see in 12 hours time, this low pressure system went from being in the Gulf of Mexico to now being off the coast of the Carolinas. And so here, this is a little bit better of a circulation. And not only that, this low pressure system has actually intensified. And so it went from 1,004 millibar low, and it is actually intensified by 4 millibars in 12 hours. So that's a pretty good intensification. It's not drastic, but it's a pretty decent intensification. And so here you can see what we have is what is called a double barrel low. And this double barrel low is indicated by two L's, or we have two centers of low pressure within a single storm system. So as that's riding up the Carolinas, you can see how this high pressure system is actually working its way a little bit further south, or is sinking south into the central part of the United States. And then 12 hours later, you can see here the high pressure system has now moved all the way down central part of the United States and is now centered over south central United States. And we notice that here our area of low pressure in 12 hours went from 1,000 millibar low to a 984 millibar low. So it really intensified in a 12-hour period. And here you can see that it's bringing snow to parts of northern New England, which would include Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And also here we have all this occlusion. So we have some heavy, intense snow occurring in New York State, down through Pennsylvania, and into parts of New Jersey. And we're looking a little bit more at rain along Manhattan and along coastal Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, which includes Cape Cod and the islands. And so here, based on this pressure pattern, you can see that here is the warm front. Now the warm front is able to actually bring in warmer air off the water into the coastal regions of southern New England. So that's why here you see that this is actually indicated in green. So this happens oftentimes with these systems. A lot of times, especially for Cape Cod and the islands, they get caught on the warmer side of a rain-snow line. And sometimes Boston tends to flip back and forth on that rain-snow line as well, depending on what's actually going on. But when you look at the entire picture, what's really interesting is that when we kind of just go through the three images, so this would be the first image, this is the second image, and that is the third image. And so when we look at all three images, you notice that what happens between the interaction between the high and the low. You notice that it's almost a gear turning. So as the high begins to sink through the central part of the United States, it allows the low to move into New England. So it's almost like a gear. It's almost like a yin and yang thing, where the high is actually dictating where the area of low pressure goes. And that makes sense based on our knowledge that we know that wind blows from high to low pressure. Now here's another storm. This is January of 1978. And again, you're going to notice similar features. So here is a 1044 millibar high centered over the Dakotas. Again, a very strong area of low pressure. And here we have another developing area of low pressure down towards the Gulf of Mexico. Now in 12 hours time, notice what happens. And so here we notice that this low hasn't traveled that much, and it really hasn't intensified, but it's still very well put together. There's a very definitive circulation. We have a nice centered area of low pressure. Here we have a little bit of a weak wave, so this low pressure is still developing. So here's a little stationary front out in front of this low. And again, we're going to watch this low move up into New England, and we're going to watch it move along the East Coast. The other interesting feature about this is that here we have a double barrel high. So instead of this high actually sinking as one unit into the Texas region, it's now being more of a bubble across the northern tier of the United States, pretty much right above the Great Lakes. And so what that's doing is that, number one, it's keeping New England nice and dry, nice and cold as well, because here this large area of high pressure, remember, it's spinning clockwise, so all of the wind is coming out of the northwest for New England. Now when we talk about snow in these systems, number one, this is January, so New England is primed for snow in this scenario, but because our wind is coming out of the northwest based on the placement of this massive area of high pressure, what this does is that the days leading up to a nor'easter moving into the New England region, this cold air is able to really pool in and actually be held into southern New England by the Appalachian Mountains. And so this is what is known as cold air damming, where cold air is really allowed to seep down from Canada into the New England territories and really just hold on to that cold air. So when this area of low pressure delivers its precipitation, it will fall as all snow. And the colder air that we have in place, the more snow that New England will get, or we look at the amount or the texture of the snow. So we're talking about light, fluffy snow compared to heavy, wet snow. So these are the type of tracks and the type of features that you notice when you talk about a Gulf Coast track type of nor'easter, where the low originates in the Gulf of Mexico, crosses over, redevelops off the South Carolina coastline, and then rides along the jet stream into southern New England.